Apartment 13. The air felt heavier since the move. Not in a way you could measure, but like a dampness that clung to the lungs, seeping into the mind late at night. The building was pristine, a modern high-rise with whitewashed hallways and polished chrome fixtures. No drafts, no creaks, just the faint buzz of the elevator and the sterile scent of fresh paint. But it was never quiet. Not really. Mia noticed at first, the muffled footsteps echoing through the ceiling long after midnight. Bare feet, slow but deliberate. She'd wake Leo, whispering, "Do you hear that?" He'd mutter, half asleep, that it was just the pipes. Old buildings. She didn't argue, at least not yet. The strange thing was, their floor plan didn't make sense. 12 apartments, neatly arranged. But at the end of the hall, where a window should be, was a door marked 13. Always locked. Always dark. The building manager, a thin man with a face like crumpled paper, shrugged when they asked. "Storage," he said, not meeting their eyes. Weeks passed. The footsteps continued. So did the stains. Dark patches spread along the wall they shared with apartment 13. At first, just faint smudges like water damage, but then deeper, blacker. No smell, but something about them felt wrong. Leo scrubbed, but the stains returned, darker each time. Then came the cat. It belonged to the old woman from 7, a mangy, gray thing with one milky eye. It used to lurk near their door, hissing at the wall beside 13. One morning, Mia found it in the hallway, sprawled out stiff, mouth open, paws frozen mid-scratch. Dried blood streaked under its claws, as if it had torn at something unseen. The maintenance man was pale when he came to clean it up. "Happens sometimes," he mumbled, dragging the body into a garbage bag. Best not to think about it. But Mia did. She thought about it constantly. Especially when she started dreaming. It was always the same. She stood in 13, staring at a windowless room where the shadows stretched too far, as if the corners were deeper than the room itself. A figure stood in the dark, not quite visible, not quite gone. She'd wake gasping, the taste of damp earth thick in her throat. One night, she stayed awake on purpose, sitting by the door with a book in her lap. The footsteps came again. Closer. Louder. Not overhead anymore, but on the other side of the wall. She pressed her ear against it, breath shallow. A voice. Faint. Not words, just the sound of breathing. Then, a single knock. On the inside. She didn't wake Leo this time. Instead, she took the spare key the landlord had given them for emergencies. It was supposed to be for their unit only, but she felt it heavy in her palm, like it belonged there. The lock turned smoothly. Inside was nothing. A room, empty. Dustless. No furniture, no lights. Just the blackened stains stretching along the walls, branching out like veins. She stepped inside, the air thick and warm, pressing against her skin. The door closed behind her. And for the first time, the silence broke. A whisper. Low. Close. You shouldn't be here. The next thing she remembered was Leo shaking her awake on their couch, hours later. No memory of leaving 13. No stains on her clothes. But the door was locked again. The next night, the footsteps stopped. But the stains spread to the ceiling. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her out of that room, clinging just beyond the edge of her vision, lingering in the spaces where shadows gathered too thickly for a modern building like this. The stains on the ceiling grew darker, spreading like ink dropped in water, but always in that same branching pattern, twisting in ways that felt more like symbols than accidents of moisture. Leo tried to reassure her, called it a wiring issue or maybe some kind of mold, but his words felt thin, spoken more for his own benefit than hers. She started keeping the lights on at night, every lamp burning well past midnight, yet the darkness never seemed to fully retreat. There were moments, brief but unmistakable, when the air felt colder despite the steady hum of the heating. Other moments when the reflections in the polished fixtures seemed just slightly delayed, as though her image had taken a heartbeat longer than it should to catch up. The nightmares returned, sharper now, more vivid. She saw 13 with perfect clarity each time, its walls not just blackened but pulsing, as if something breathed beneath them. The figure in the shadows felt closer, and there was a sensation, more than a sight, fingertips icy against her wrist, the taste of damp earth stronger now, bitter, metallic, almost coppery. She woke up gagging, the smell still lingering as if she'd inhaled it in her sleep. When the noises came back, they were louder. No longer just footsteps. Scraping, slow, deliberate, from inside 13. Like nails dragged along the other side of the wall. And then the whispers, too faint to catch words, but low, persistent, rhythmic in a way that made her think of chanting. By the third night, she knew she couldn't pretend anymore. She made Leo sit with her, both of them facing the locked door at the end of the hall, their own front door cracked open just enough for a line of light to spill across the floor. Hours passed, silence thickening until it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Nothing. Not even the usual distant hum of the elevator. And then 3 knocks. Soft. Hollow. From inside apartment 13. Leo shot up, pale, his face twisting between disbelief and something much closer to fear. He didn't speak, just stared at the door as though waiting for it to move on its own. When nothing else came, he laughed, too forced, and muttered something about late-night pranksters. But Mia saw how tightly his fist stayed clenched. The next morning, the stains spread again. This time, they bled into their unit. Thin, jagged lines tracing down from the ceiling, curling behind picture frames, stretching across the plaster in patterns far too intricate for water damage. They reminded Mia of roots, gnarled, searching. Or veins. The building manager wasn't helpful. He stood outside their door with that same crumpled paper expression, hands shoved deep into his pockets, muttering about how these things happen in old places, even when Mia reminded him the building was barely 2 years old. When she pointed to the stains, he just nodded, promising to send someone. No one ever came. That night, Leo suggested they stay somewhere else for a few days. Mia agreed, not because she thought it would help, but because the idea of sleeping under that growing web of blackness made her skin crawl. They packed light, just enough for a couple of nights, leaving the apartment quiet and still with the windows firmly shut. But when they returned, the walls were clean. Every trace of the stains, gone. Even the ones that had soaked so deeply they'd felt permanent. Leo was relieved, but Mia wasn't. There was no sign of scrubbing, no chemical smell, no damage to the paint. It was as if the stains had never existed. She checked 13's door again. Locked. No sign of forced entry. That night, she woke to the sound of breathing. Not beside her, but just behind the bedroom wall. And when she turned on the light, the shadows seemed to ripple. Mia barely slept after that, lying stiff beneath the covers while the breathing, soft, measured, undeniably human, pressed against the other side of the wall. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, the mind playing tricks in the dark, yet every inch of her body felt it. A presence. Close. Observing. By morning, the breathing had stopped, but the silence left in its place felt heavier, as if something was waiting. Leo seemed calmer, almost too calm, brushing off her growing unease with half-hearted reassurances. He didn't hear the sounds, he said. Didn't smell the damp earth that still clung to the air in moments when the lights flickered. But the stains returned that night. Not on the walls this time. They were under the bed. Mia found them when she dropped her phone and knelt to retrieve it, the beam of the screen catching those same black veins spreading along the hardwood. It was thicker now, deeper, like something was pressing up from beneath the floor itself. She didn't tell Leo. Not right away. Instead, she did what anyone losing their mind would do, she started researching. The building was new, but the land wasn't. Old city blocks, leveled years ago for redevelopment. No tragedies. No unexplained deaths. No history, at least, not the kind easily found in public records. But there was one thing. A demolition permit. 13 years ago, another building stood on this very plot. A fire. Electrical, according to the papers, though no official cause was ever determined. 4 units completely destroyed. Including apartment 13. No survivors. Mia sat with that knowledge for too long, the screen glaring in the dim kitchen. Her hands shook, the words blurring together. That had to be it, right? Some kind of lingering energy. Residual trauma. She told herself she understood. Until the mirror cracked. It was small at first. Barely noticeable. A hairline fracture along the edge of the bathroom mirror. But the next morning, the crack widened, a jagged split branching toward the center. Then another appeared. On the living room window. Leo still refused to leave. Said they were just cracks. Just old construction settling. But Mia knew better. The shapes, those branching, curling veins, were identical to the stains. She stayed awake again that night, pacing, the taste of dampness sharp at the back of her throat. When the sounds came again, this time louder, clearer, she couldn't stop herself. She unlocked their front door and stepped into the hallway. The air was colder out there, the usual hum of the building's heat silent. The door to 13 was waiting, the brass numbers dull against the dim light. For a moment, she almost convinced herself to turn back. But then she saw it. The stains. Seeping out from beneath the door, curling toward her feet. She knocked. The sound echoed, unnatural, like she was knocking on something hollow. From the other side. A voice. A whisper, so close she felt the breath of it. You were warned. The door opened. But it didn't swing inward. It pulled, sucked open with a deep, wet sound, the darkness inside pressing out like a wave of cold air. And someone, stood just beyond the threshold. A figure. Half seen, half formed. Pale skin, sunken eyes. No irises. Just black. But she knew that face. Because it was hers. And then. The door slammed shut. The stains were gone. And the voice whispered, louder now. Not yet. Mia barely remembered how she got back into her apartment. One moment, the door to 13 had slammed shut, the echo reverberating so deep in her chest it felt like it had rattled loose something essential. The next, she was on the couch, her knees drawn up, the lights on but doing nothing to push back the oppressive weight pressing against the walls. She could still feel the damp chill from that open door, could hear the whisper curling around her mind like smoke, not yet. But what did that mean? Not yet for what? Leo found her there hours later, pale and trembling, her breath shallow as though she'd been running, but she hadn't moved. He didn't ask why her hands were shaking, or why she flinched when he touched her shoulder. Maybe he was afraid of the answer. Maybe he'd begun to feel it too. The stains were still gone the next morning. The cracks in the mirrors, the ceiling, the floor, all of it. Even the air felt different, lighter, but only for a while. The calm was a mask stretched too thin, and Mia could sense it fraying. She didn't mention what she'd seen, herself, or the darkness pressing in from behind the door. She wasn't sure how to explain it, wasn't even sure she hadn't imagined it completely. But then came the calls. They started late that evening. The landline, which they'd only kept for emergencies, crackled to life at 1 in the morning. Leo didn't stir, but Mia was already awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting. She let it ring, expecting it to stop after the 3rd or 4th tone. It didn't. 10 rings. 15. Then silence. She hadn't even realized she was counting until it stopped. And then, it started again. This time, she answered. At first, just static. A low, persistent hiss. but underneath, there was something. A rhythm. Breathing, slow and wet, like air forced through damp cloth. She whispered into the receiver, voice hoarse, demanding to know who was there. The breathing stopped. And a voice, her own voice, came through the line. "You opened the door." She hung up, hard hammering so hard it hurt. And then the line rang again. Leo woke to find her crying in the kitchen the next morning, clutching the cordless phone so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She didn't tell him about the voice, just that there had been a call, some sick prank. His solution was to unplug the phone completely, and when she hesitated, he reminded her that none of this was real. That they were both just exhausted. Stressed. Imagining things. She let him believe that. But the whispers didn't stop. The next night, they came from inside the walls. Soft at first, barely audible beneath the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the old pipes, but then clearer, louder, closer. Whispering from inside the vents. From beneath the floorboards. Her voice, again and again, echoing in places she shouldn't be. And the stains returned. Worse now, branching not just on the walls but up from the floor, seeping across the wood in curling patterns like roots searching for something. No, not searching. Reaching. Mia woke just before dawn, the air so cold her breath curled in mist. And there, across the far wall, the stains had spread so far they no longer looked random. They were forming words. "Let me in." The next morning, Leo told her they needed to leave. He didn't explain why, didn't argue anymore. He packed in silence, stuffing clothes into a duffel while she stood frozen in the doorway, watching his reflection in the black, cracked screen of the television. Only, it wasn't his reflection. The figure in the glass was watching her. And when she finally blinked, the words not yet remained, burned into the screen. They didn't leave. Because that night, something knocked on their bedroom door. From the inside. The knock wasn't loud. No more than a soft, deliberate tap tap tap, just enough to stir Mia from her uneasy sleep. The room was darker than usual, the city lights struggling through the heavy curtains. At first, she thought it was Leo shifting beside her. But no, he was there, breathing steadily, his face half buried in the pillow, oblivious. The knocking came again. Inside the room. The bedroom door stood closed, but as she stared, the pale sliver of space between it and the frame seemed wrong, too dark, too deep. Like a void pressing against the wood. She sat up slowly, pulse hammering. The door didn't open. But the handle turned. No sound of metal shifting, just the unnatural, almost soundless motion of it twisting all the way down. And then releasing. A cold draft slipped into the room, carrying that damp, earthy scent she'd come to dread. She nudged Leo, panic welling as her voice caught in her throat, but the moment he stirred, the handle snapped back. The void behind the door seemed to recede, folding into itself. No sign of the stains. No black streaks across the wood. Mia stayed awake for hours after, staring at that door, waiting. Nothing came. Until morning. It wasn't just the walls anymore. The stains had crept onto the ceiling, above the bed. Coiling, spreading. And this time, they weren't random. They had taken a shape. A face. Her face. Leo saw it too. He didn't speak, just stood frozen at the foot of the bed, pale and shaking. When he finally whispered, it wasn't the reassurance she had hoped for. "We have to get out." No. But the locks wouldn't turn. The door, the windows, sealed. No chains. No barriers. Just resistance. Like the wood itself was pressing back, refusing them passage. And then the landline rang. A shrill, electric wail that made them both jump. Mia didn't want to answer. But she had to. Static. Then breathing. Then her voice. "I warned you." The line went dead. Leo grabbed the nearest chair, slamming it against the living room window with everything he had. The glass didn't shatter. It didn't even crack. The stains were on the glass too now, crawling along the edges, twisting. The shape of her face, her reflection warping in the spreading blackness, smiling. But Mia wasn't smiling. She backed away, heart racing, feeling that wrongness pressing in. Something else was here. Not just in the walls. It was in her. The voice wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was whispering behind her eyes. And when she blinked, she was standing inside apartment 13. The door was closed. And Leo was still outside, pounding on the other side. Mia! Open the door! Let me in! But she couldn't. Because it wasn't her hands holding the lock. It was hers. The other her. And that whisper. Not yet. The pounding on the door was slower now, heavier, each blow echoing with a deep, almost hollow resonance that seemed to pulse inside Mia's chest rather than around her. Leo's voice had shifted too, muffled, distant, as if he were calling from the bottom of some vast, empty space rather than just beyond the door. His words blended with the dull rhythm, no longer clear shouts, but desperate, pleading vibrations, her name stretched thin, unraveling into nothing. She could still see him, or at least the shape of him, through the peephole, though it was difficult to tell where the warped glass ended and the distortion of the space beyond began. The corridor seemed stretched, the pale walls bleeding into shadow as though the building itself were exhaling, making more room for something that shouldn't be there. Inside, the air was dense with silence, the kind that made her skin prickle, yet it wasn't truly quiet. That whisper, the one she tried to convince herself was in her head, was louder now, more distinct, curling around the edges of the room like a damp fog pressing against her ears. It wasn't one voice but many, overlapping, hushed yet urgent, their words tangled together so closely that she could only make out fragments, though one phrase kept repeating, clearer than the rest, pressing against her skull with a patient, cruel certainty. You opened the door. Now you belong here. Her gaze was drawn to the far wall where the stains had spread further than before, sprawling across the plaster in tendrils so dark they seemed to pulse, almost breathing. The patterns weren't random anymore, though they hadn't been for a while, had they? She just hadn't wanted to admit what they resembled. Faces. Not hers alone now, but shifting, bleeding into one another. Eyes wide, mouths twisted, some open as if screaming, others frozen mid-whisper. A sharp sound, Leo's fist striking the door again, yanked her attention back, but this time it was weaker, more fragile, like whatever was outside had drained him to the edge of collapse. She forced herself closer, pressing an ear against the cold wood, ignoring the sickly dampness that spread along its surface. His voice was faint now. No longer calling her name but sobbing it, the way a child might when they realize they've been left behind. Something moved behind her. No sound of footsteps. Just presence. Mia turned, pulse hammering, but there was no one there, only the mirror. It wasn't cracked anymore. It was splitting, thin black fractures webbing out from its center, not breaking the glass, but spreading, as if something behind it was pressing outward. The reflection watching her wasn't quite right, either. It was her face, but it didn't blink when she did, didn't breathe in time with her own shallow, ragged gasps. And then it whispered. Let him in, Mia. It's the only way. The voice was hers, yet wrong. Slower. Richer. Like it had been echoing for far too long in some cavernous void and forgotten the shape of words. Leo's pounding stopped. Silence swallowed the apartment, thick and total, a silence so deep it seemed to press against her skin. She held her breath, waiting, hoping, until the door unlatched itself. The sound was quiet, almost polite, a soft metallic click. She hadn't moved. But the door was open now. And beyond it, the hallway wasn't the same. The modern plaster and clean lines were gone, swallowed by damp stone walls, flickering with a pale, uneven light. The air that drifted in was heavy with damp earth, mold, the smell of something long forgotten. And at the far end of that impossible corridor, Leo. Or something that looked like Leo. But his skin, so pale it was nearly translucent. His eyes were round too, the irises clouded, dark like deep water, too wide as he stared straight at her with an expression not of fear, but expectation. He raised one hand, not in a wave, but a beckoning, the motion too slow, too deliberate. The whispering behind her grew louder, overlapping voices now, pressing close enough that she could feel the chill of them against her neck, urging, pleading, demanding. Bring him inside. Or stay forever. Her hand lifted, shaking, moving toward the door, though she wasn't certain it was her will anymore. Her skin felt too cold, too distant, as if something else had taken root inside her, hollowing her out from the inside. And then she saw it. The stains. Not on the walls anymore. On her hands. The black, curling veins spreading across her fingers, up her wrists, reaching deeper, no, not reaching. Growing. The voice behind her was inside her now, filling the space where her own thoughts had been. And when she met her reflection again, it was smiling. Not with her face. But with its face. The door slammed shut on its own, cutting off the impossible corridor, the pale figure, the void. And when Mia turned back, she was alone. Except for the whisper. Still there. Soft. Patient. Not yet.